The following program is an original production of Link TV.
Many people write about the Middle East, but very few of us have lived it. Robert Fisk has lived it for many years. I want you to please welcome him. Thank you.
I was very pleased to find that Barbara didn't ask you to turn off your mobile phones. Because about a year ago in Dublin, Ireland, I said that anyone whose mobile phone rang while I was speaking would be sold into slavery. And immediately a mobile phone rang. And it was mine. So keep your mobile phones on, there's no problem at all. I'm not going to give you a hard sell on my book tonight. There probably aren't enough copies to try to do that. But I would like to try and tell you about what it was like to write it and what I learned about the Middle East by writing it. And what I discovered at the end was the purpose of the book. I think I only realized this when I was writing the last pages. But I think what I was trying to do in The Great War for Civilization, and I'll be using this for quotation marks tonight, which tells you a lot about the Middle East. I think what I was trying to do was to persuade people to refuse to accept the narrative of history as it is set out for us by our presidents and prime ministers and generals and by our journalists. One of the central characters in my book, actually in the center of the book, not a character throughout, is my own father, William Fisk, or Bill Fisk as he was known. Bill Fisk was much older than my mother, and so in 1918, at the age of 19, he found himself a soldier fighting in the Second Battle of the Somme in the First World War. He was sent to the trenches of France near Albert and Arras. And when he died, aged 93, in 1992, I inherited his campaign medal. On the back were engraved the words, "The Great War for Civilization." And when I received the medal, I realized that, ironically, it had to be the title of my book. My father thought he was fighting the Great War for Civilization. Well, he did think that until he read the diaries of General Haig and the other British and French commanders and realized that they had lied and that the lions had been sent to die by donkeys. My father, too, refused to accept a narrative. In his old age, in his later middle age, he was a very right-wing man. I fell out with him constantly. He loved the British Tory party. He liked policemen, capital punishments, courts, magistrates. When he was dying, I didn't go and see him in his nursing home. I let him die. So in a sense, I think this book is also, to some extent, an apology to him. For in the First World War, he was ordered to command a firing party to execute a young Australian soldier, 19 years old, the same age as him. Gunner Frank Wills of the Royal Artillery was condemned to death by a British military court for shooting dead a British military policeman in Paris. My father made a point of telling me that he had refused to execute this young man, although of course he was bound to die anyway. I thought it was the finest thing he did because he refused to accept the narrative of war whereby you are ordered to kill your fellow man and you refused to do so. I did go to the National Archives in London and look up the files on Gunner Frank Wills. He'd been at Gallipoli in 1915 fighting in the Australian army, had been invalided out of the army, still wanted to fight in the war, went off to London and joined a British regiment. Big mistake. The Brits executed each other, the Australians didn't. And when I looked up his file, I found his last appeal to clemency. He promised the court he would live a straightforward life if given the chance to live. He was not given that chance. He was executed at 3:14 in the morning on a March morning in 1919, long after the First World War was over. I did approach the execution envelope with a certain amount of concern because my black journalistic owl, which sits in the minds of most journalists, wondered, did my father tell the truth? But the officer who commanded the execution was not my father. It was a man with a different name, different regiment, different age. So Bill Fisk kept his word. He didn't execute anyone. But in the 17 months that followed my father's First World War, in the 17 months after Second Lieutenant Bill Fisk of the 12th Battalion King's Liverpool Regiment marched into the small village of Louvencourt in northern France on the 11th of November 1918, in just 17 months, the victors, the British and the French, drew the borders of Northern Ireland, Yugoslavia, and most of the Middle East. And I have spent my entire professional career as a journalist in Belfast and Bosnia and Belgrade and Baghdad and Beirut, watching the people in those borders burn and suffer. This was a deeply depressing book to write. The first 200 pages were quite good fun. I had a French researcher who'd gone through 328,000 pages of notebooks, documents, files, propaganda leaflets dropped from aeroplanes, everything that my magpie instinct as a journalist had got together every month and stuffed into laundry bags of third-rate hotels. And when she brought to me the first notebooks of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the descendants of Stalingrad in the snows of the Hindu Kush, the Iranian Revolution, the first days of the Iran-Iraq War, there was a kind of schoolboy adventure for me in all this. When my foreign editor first asked me to be the Middle East correspondent of the Times, this is pre-Murdoch, before the papivore came to eat the Times, the paper eater, I was in Portugal covering the aftermath of the Portuguese Revolution, and I received a letter from Louis Heron saying that our Middle East correspondent, Paul Martin, was leaving Beirut because he'd just married a billionaire German princess who did not want to spend the early years of her married life in a war. He said to me, "It will be a great adventure and there'll be lots of sunshine." I first wanted to be a foreign correspondent when I watched, aged 12, Alfred Hitchcock's wonderful movie, Foreign Correspondent. Hands up here who's seen Foreign Correspondent. One, there's a few. Oldies, mostly like me. Yeah, I should think we've got about, over there, I think we've got about 15 people. So I better tell you about Foreign Correspondent. Joel McCrea plays Huntley Haverstock, crime correspondent of the New York Daily Globe. Black and white. This is a creaky, patriotic movie, of course. He chases Gestapo agents, tracks down Germany's top agent in London, is almost assassinated by the Gestapo, witnesses the assassination of a European prime minister, is shot down by a German pocket battleship over the Atlantic, is rescued by an American destroyer to file the greatest scoop of his life, and wins the most glamorous woman in the movie. And I thought to myself, this sounds like the job for me. On the Shatt al-Arab River, which divides Iran from Iraq in 1980, a British ship found itself marooned. And through reasons too complex and too boring to explain, my colleague John Snow of Independent Television News, now a very famous anchorman on Channel 4 television in Britain, was asked to rescue the crew at night from the ship. He got hold of a bunch of Iraqi commandos. In these days, of course, we wanted Iraq to invade Iran, so the Iraqi soldiers, rather than being war criminals, were elite units. We loved the Iraqi army then. And he told me that if I could get him an British Admiralty map of the Shatt al-Arab River, I could come along for the adventure. So I found one. Norwegian captain gave it to me. And we set off over this half-sunken date plantation island at night. Mosquitoes buzzing around us, bullets whizzing by every so often at hip height when the dogs went and alerted the Iranians that there were some horrible foreigners there. And John eventually swam out in flippers and with the Iraqi commando squad, got the crew onto their lifeboat, and Fisk pulled the lifeboat in from the island on a hawser with the crew on board. Being a British ship, most of the crew was Sri Lankan and Indian. And they arrived with the few British citizens on board, all safe, along with their massive hoard of duty-free colour television sets and fridges in the lifeboat. Of course, you can't take fridges and colour television sets across waterlogged islands that are snapping with bullets. So it was my mournful duty to take each colour television set and each fridge and chuck it back into the Shatt al-Arab River. In any event, they were all rescued. John made his movie. I took it out, along with my report for the Times, to Kuwait and then by air to Amman. John, of course, had done the hard bit. He'd gone across the Shatt al-Arab River at night on his own with the Iraqis in flippers. And I just sat on the seashore, hoping not to get shot. So in the morning, when I woke up at the Jordanian Amman Intercontinental Hotel, there was a telex, no emails in those days, there was a telex beneath my door from my foreign desk. It said, "Why you no swam shark-infested Shatt al-Arab River." When I finished writing this section of the book, and it's all there, I took it to a very dear friend of mine and read it to them. And she said, "It's beautiful, what happens now?" And I said, "There's nothing else happy in the book. From now onwards, it's a story of death, tragedy, betrayal, injustice, torture, dictatorship, ethnic cleansing, genocide." And she said, that is the end of the sweet stories. And so the paragraph after this adventure begins, "There is the end of the sweet stories." And I fear that writing this book became ever more depressing. You know, it's one thing to go to the Iranian front line for 3 weeks and then come out and go home on holiday, enjoy Christmas, go out to dinner, spend some time in Europe, go back to Beirut, and then go back to the war again. But when you take all the middle bits out and you push together the story of the suffering of that war and all the others, you realize how much suffering existed. One of the things I found actually in concluding this book, which includes the Algerian War, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, the invasion of Afghanistan, the Iran-Iraq War, the Kuwait invasion, the depleted uranium, sanctions on Iraq, and so on. One of the things I realized when I got to the end is how surprised I was at how restrained Muslims had been with us. Not the opposite, but how restrained they'd been. But it was a very depressing book to write. One day my researcher came down to my library and just said to me, "Robert, we're going for a walk on the beach and I'm going to buy you a pint of Guinness in the pub. Get away from it. Leave." It's not a happy book, and I never want to write a book like this again. I'm not sure, in retrospect, what our job as a foreign correspondent really should be, although I have a suspicion I know. I used to think, in those happy days when I was 29 and 30, that our job was to record the first pages of history, that we would write those first pages, that we would see wars before anyone else did, that no one else could say, "We didn't know, no one told us." But more than 2 years ago in Jerusalem, I was talking to Amira Haas, that very fine Israeli journalist who writes for Haaretz, and whose work, by the way, is more eloquent and more courageous than any other Western reporters out of the Middle East. And she said, "No, Robert, you're wrong. Our job is to monitor the centers of power." Those were her words, to monitor the centers of power, to challenge authority, especially when they go to war, especially when they're going to kill people, and especially when they do lies to do it. And I think that remains the best description of our job, or of what our job should be, that I've ever heard. Amira's own description comes from her mother's experience in the Second World War. Her mother, who of course was Jewish, was a partisan with Tito's forces in resisting the Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia. I think she came from the town of Cetinje. And at one point during the war, the Germans occupied the town and said that they would shoot all the women in the town unless Amira's mother surrendered, which of course she did. She was taken prisoner by the Gestapo and sent to a concentration camp in Germany. And she had, according to Amira, this extraordinary experience of one day walking up from the rail yard to the camp, up a middle-class German road. And the German housewives who'd just finished breakfast were walking out of the house very carefully and neatly dressed, middle-class area, drying their cups and their saucers and their cutlery, and stood at the front gate and watched the Jewish prisoners coming up the road. And Amira said, "The one thing I cannot stand is people who stand aside and watch." People who stand aside and watch. How many times as a journalist I've watched people stand aside and watch. The book, I suppose, is also a kind of warning. I recall in it how in 1992 I made a film series for Discovery Channel and for Channel 4 television in Britain called Beirut to Bosnia, How Muslims Are Coming to Hate the West. We filmed, it was real film, a cinema film. We filmed in Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, Egypt, South Lebanon, Beirut. We filmed in Croatia, and Bosnia, and Poland. $1 million, which was a lot of money in those days to make a big television documentary on film. And in one scene in 1992, I walk into a burning mosque in the village of Chela in Serb-occupied Bosnia. I'd been there a year before, met the imam in his house, visited his very beautiful little square mosque, and the Serbs had promised then to protect it. Now it was on fire and the imam had disappeared. And as I walk into the mosque, you hear my voice on the soundtrack, and I say, I'm quoting myself exactly, "When I see things like this, I think of the area where I live, the Middle East, where when violence occurs, we call it mindless terrorism. But when I see things like this," I say on the soundtrack, "I wonder what the Muslim world has in store for us. Maybe I should end each of my reports with the words, 'Watch out.'" 1992. When Victoria Fontaine, my researcher, went back and tracked through the cuts in the film, she found that I walked into that burning mosque on the 11th of September 1992, just 9 years too short. In the subsequent broadcasts, Canadian television, once or twice with Amy Goodman on the radio of the United States, and British television, I found little references in interviews with me where I kept saying to people, it's not that good in the Middle East. I know Israel's got another treaty, a peace treaty, but there's an explosion coming. I used twice that phrase, there's an explosion coming. I didn't know, I knew nothing. But living in the Middle East, I felt it. I knew something was going to burst, something was going to happen. It was interesting that when my film series was shown on the Discovery Channel, the American press largely derided it on the grounds that it was sensationalist and that Muslims were not coming to hate the West. They saw no reason for any frustration. On September the 11th, 2001, I was crossing the Atlantic on my way to America. Just before we took off, I'd received a call from the features editor to tell me that for the second time, a long investigation which I conducted into the Sabra and Shatila massacres of September 16th, 18th, 1982 had been postponed. The second reason, he said, was because a light aircraft had flown into one of the towers of the World Trade Center. Damn, I said. My investigation, in fact, proved fairly conclusively that while 800 Palestinians were killed between the 16th and the 18th of September, 800 others had been handed over as prisoners by the Israelis who had questioned them back to the Phalangist murderers who took them away and held them hostage for 2 weeks in an attempt to use them as bargaining chips to get back Phalangists who had been taken prisoner by Muslims. When they didn't get their prisoners back, all 800 Palestinians were executed into mass graves. We know the location of one of them in East Beirut. This story then was suddenly not going to run. Then, of course, my mobile phone rang again, and it was an airliner that had hit the tower of the World Trade Center. And then, of course, I could understand there'd be no Sabra and Shatila investigation in the paper that night. Then it was a second plane, and I realized this is not a tragedy, this is an attack. We took off, and I was using the satellite phone in the business class seat, talking to the office again and again. 3 aircraft, the Pentagon, 4 aircraft, 1 crashed in Pennsylvania. So I went up to the crew at the front of the aircraft and said, you better tell the captain, I don't know how much of this he knows. And the captain came back immediately. He'd only heard of 1 aircraft. So I told him about the others. He asked more information. I called London again. It was a very eerie situation to be flying towards America high over the North Atlantic, talking to someone in London about something that was happening in New York and Washington. And the stewardess at the front of the aircraft said, there must have been a lot of people involved. They must have made dummy runs. She said, where did the planes come from? And at this stage, we didn't know they were domestic flights taking off from Newark and Boston and so on. They could have come from Latin America, Europe, Africa. And the purser and I looked at each other. And we went round the plane together with a little piece of paper, looking for passengers we didn't like. Of course. I found 13, 2 in business class. He found 14. Most of them were identical, the seat numbers. Of course, they were Muslims, weren't they? They had darker skin, brown eyes. They were reading the Quran or using worry beads or looking at me suspiciously because I was looking at them suspiciously. And I realized that in just 2 minutes, Osama bin Laden, for I was sure he lay behind it, had turned nice, friendly, liberal Bob into a racist, I was racially profiling the totally innocent passengers on my aircraft. And it dawned on me then that one of the reasons for 9/11 was not to divide necessarily Muslims from the West or Muslims from Christians, whoever they are, but to divide the innocent from the innocent. I met bin Laden 3 times. The last time I met him, he said to me his last words in a camp on the top of a mountain in Afghanistan, a camp, of course, originally built by the CIA because he used to be on our side. He said to me, "Mr. Robert, from the mountain upon which you're sitting, we defeated the Soviet army and helped to destroy the Soviet Union." Exaggeration, but I thought there had some truth in it. Then he said, "And Mr. Robert, I pray to God that he permits us to turn America into a shadow of itself." And my notebook of that conversation, because I've gone through all the notebooks, I've written at the time 3 vertical lines on each side of the paragraph where I quote that last sentence, and wrote in the margin, "Rhetoric, question mark." I shouldn't have put the question mark. I shouldn't have put the rhetoric. When I got back to Europe and turned on the television set, obviously the plane turned around when America closed its airspace, and saw the Twin Towers coming down in that biblical horror, that fog of smoke and dust spreading over lower Manhattan, I remember thinking, well, now New York is a shadow of itself. But the big question for journalists that night, in the hours that immediately followed September 11, was the question, why? We were allowed to ask the question, who? 19 Arabs who claimed they were Muslims. We were allowed to ask, how? Box cutters, aeroplanes, tall buildings. But the moment we asked why, the world exploded around journalists. Because to ask the question why, we were quickly informed, was to be on the side of terrorism. That night, I was asking the question why a lot on radio and television, as I was in the first report I filed to my newspaper from the aircraft. And I ended up on an Irish radio show with a professor from Harvard who shall remain nameless. It was Alan Dershowitz, of course. And he came on, I asked the why question. He said, "Mr. Fisk is a dangerous man. To ask the why question, to ask why means you're on the side of terrorists, you're anti-American, and to be anti-American is the same as to be anti-Semitic." That's what he said. And I remember thinking, I think I've got the message now. I think I've got the message. If we're going to look in the context of the Middle East, we're Nazis. Indeed, postcards followed, most of them from the United States, after this broadcast, and after I wrote about the broadcast, of course, which said that my mother was Adolf Eichmann's daughter. My mum, by the way, was in the Royal Air Force in 1940, repairing radios on damaged Spitfires during the Battle of Britain, but it doesn't matter. The fact of the matter is that, as the late Edward Said said, America's relationship with the Middle East, with both Arabs and Israelis, is the one taboo subject left in America. You can talk about gays, blacks, lesbians, anything you want, but don't let's get involved in the United States policy in the Middle East. Of course, if you look at, well, there's no crime in Berkeley, but if you look at any crime anywhere in America, the first thing the cops do is look for a motive. But when we had an international crime against humanity in New York, Washington, and Pennsylvania, the one thing we were not allowed to do was look for a motive. Like 19 guys, these were Arabs, these men. They come from the Middle East. Is there a problem out there? No, Israel was not responsible for September 11, 2001. But the environment from which these men came needs to be closely scrutinized. What happened in the Middle East? What have we been doing in the Middle East? What are we doing there now? These were questions that were not meant to be asked, and largely were not, and certainly largely were not in the mainstream press in this country or on television. They hated us because of our freedom, because we're good. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. We'll switch it off there. Thank you very much. You know, the strangest thing about all this, in the aftermath of it, was that if you go back in the history books and start researching through even the story of Iraq, you come across the most extraordinary, prescient ghosts of the future, as I call them. In writing about Iraq for my book, I went right back much, much earlier to the British invasion of Iraq in 1917. Actually, the first invasions of our sort of modern Europe came when Napoleon took the French expedition to Egypt in the 18th century. When he did, by the way, he issued a proclamation to the people of Cairo saying he was coming to free them from the pashas who were hanging those of them who wanted free speech. General Angus Maude was Commander-in-Chief British Army Mesopotamia and arrived in Baghdad in the autumn of 1917. British troops conquered all of Iraq. He put on the wall of Baghdad a poster, proclamation to the people of the Muhafazat, the governorate of Baghdad. A young soldier, Private Charles Dickens of the Cheshire Regiment, thought it might be important one day, so he peeled one off, put it in his rucksack, where it remained for 2 years, stained with his perspiration of the Iraqi summer heat, and eventually he passed it on to his daughter, who, in February of 2003, sold it to me at auction for $2,000. And I framed it, and it stood framed beside my desk as I wrote The Great War for Civilization. Proclamation to the people of the Governorate of Baghdad, General Maude wrote. We come here not as conquerors, but as liberators, to free you from generations of tyranny, it said. Sound familiar? General Angus Maude, not George W. Bush, Angus Maude. He died a few days later because he didn't boil his milk, cholera. His grave, by the way, is now in the British War Cemetery, at North Wall War Cemetery in Baghdad. We didn't have refrigeration in those days. Our soldiers lie where they died in Iraq. I went into that cemetery this August, to take pictures of their graves, 18, 19, 20, 21, the same ages as your soldiers and our soldiers who are coming back dead from Iraq today. And while I was there, American military patrol came into the cemetery and started walking through the long grass. You have to be very careful when you approach Americans in Baghdad at the moment, in case they think you're a suicide bomber. So my usual tactic is to have a big pipe in my mouth. I don't think insurgents smoke pipes in Iraq, and say, "Good morning, gentlemen." It tends to work. The sergeant turned around and said, "Good morning, sir." I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "We're looking for weapons." And I said, "Don't you think you should read the gravestones?" Because in 1920, an insurgency began against the British occupation of Iraq. It began with the assassination of a British officer called Leachman at a village called Khandari, near Abu Ghraib, our favourite prison. And I know Khandari very well, because I went to Khandari in 2003 to report on the first death of an American soldier by a roadside bomb. His blood was still on the road. And I also met the grandson of the man who shot Colonel Leachman in 1920. And he said, yes, he died 100 feet away from the road where the American has just died. In 1920, the British took their retaliation upon the Iraqi insurgents by bombarding with artillery a city called Fallujah. In 1920, later the same year, the British army surrounded the holy city of Najaf and demanded the surrender of a Shiite cleric called Badr, not Sadr, Badr. In that same year of 1920, British military intelligence in Baghdad sent a telegram to the War Office in London, what's now the Ministry of Defence. Terrorists, they said, were crossing the Iraqi border from, yes, Syria. Spot on, that's what it said. David Lloyd George, British Prime Minister in 1920, according to the Times Parliamentary Report, which I looked up and quote in my book, told the British Parliament that if British troops leave Iraq now, there will be civil war. Yeah, that's what he said. It's fingerprint, identical history. Quite extraordinary to go back and read this. We didn't read it, of course. We didn't read it before March and April of 2003. None of us did. It would have helped, wouldn't it? Maybe Tony Blair could have said, George, look, there is this little problem we had there before. But no, we were going... I should add, I mean, it's actually much more powerful than this. Prisoners, Turkish prisoners, who in fact were Arab prisoners in the Ottoman army, were taken to prison camps in India where they were abused by their guards. There are more parallels still. In Basra in 1916, British intelligence told the British government that the British army would be welcomed with flowers and cheers when we entered Baghdad. I mean, it is absolutely, word perfectly, the same. What do we say about Iraq now? The Americans must leave. The Americans will leave. And the Americans can't leave. And that's the equation that turns sand into blood. I've argued and been angered by, for many, many months now, what I call hotel journalism. The reporter who goes to Baghdad, stays in his hotel room, uses his mobile phone to call the Americans or the British in the green zone, the area of the former presidential palace of Saddam Hussein, or talks to the Iraqi government that's been democratically elected, etc., and files his story, but does not tell his viewer or his listener or his reader that he doesn't leave his hotel. There's no health warning. You get the impression he's able to wander the streets, go out on a tour d'horizon, check out the stories when the Americans say 142 terrorists we killed in Tel Afar, no innocent people at all. That in some way he's been able to check it out, so it's all true. Comma, American officials say becomes the watchword. This phrase, American officials say, it's become part of our life of journalism now, part of the way we write. Let me give you an example of this. This is the Los Angeles Times of Wednesday. In a battle of wits, Iraq's insurgency mastermind stays a step ahead of the US. It's an excuse by the military as to how Zarqawi, if indeed he exists, and I have my doubts, how Zarqawi has managed to be one step ahead of the Americans. But look at the sourcing. I ask you not to laugh till the end of this bit. Here are the sources quoted. Page 1, column 1, US authorities say, US officials said. Column 2, officials said, US authorities say, US officials said. Turn to page A10, column 1, several US officials familiar said. Those officials said. The officials confirmed. American officials said. Column 2, the US officials stressed. Column 3, US authorities believe, said one senior US intelligence official, US officials said, Jordanian officials said. Column 4, several US officials said, the US officials said. Column 5, American officials said. Column 6, say US officials say, US officials say, one US counterterrorism official said. I think the Los Angeles Times should be called US officials say. It's much easier. It can be actually published in Washington. You don't need to worry about anything else. But coming back to this problem of journalism in Iraq, you see it's in the interests of the Americans and the British that we can't move around. They don't want us to go and count innocent dead bodies in bombed buildings in Tel Afar, even when film comes back from brave Iraqi cameramen showing that among the insurgents, and of course there are insurgents killed, are women and children and innocent civilian men as well. What do you do about hotel journalism? I don't blame journalists who can't go out. They've got special forces, veterans advising them, former British SAS men, editors who say the insurance company won't insure you unless you stay in your hotel. Some reporters now are helicoptered from the green zone to the airport. I still do the airport road, which is a fearsome, fearsome trip. Those of us who do manage to go out and do carry on, Patrick Cockburn, for example, of The Independent, the Financial Times, until he was kidnapped, mercifully only briefly, the Guardian correspondent as well. The Guardian's just said 2 days ago it is not sending any more reporters back to Baghdad. And me, I go around in the streets of Baghdad still with 2 Iraqi friends and a beat-up old black car, or sometimes a red car and sometimes a white car. We change them around. But what kind of journalism can we do? I call it mouse journalism. Example, August, 2 suicide bombings in the Nahda bus station in Baghdad. Fisk goes out, bit of street reporting, drives to the area, 2 Iraqi friends with me, get to the scene, severed body parts, bus is on fire. I jump out of the car, take 2 pictures, one of a baby burning next to a bus. And I have 20 seconds interviewing an eyewitness before 40 or 50 Iraqis are banging on the roof of my car in fury and anger. And I jump in the car and race away. Mouse journalism, right? It's enough for 600 words. But I ask myself now, and it's the first time I've ever done this in the Middle East, can we carry on operating like this? Can we carry on with this assignment? Is the risk worth the story, or is the story worth the risk? Yesterday, the building which houses the Independent's office was suicide bombed by 2 suicide bombers. Our staff correspondent who was there happened to be reading in bed at 8:30 in the morning, I asked myself, but he was. If he'd been standing up, he'd be dead because the windows came in on him. Can we carry on in Baghdad? I'm not sure. You can still find out little fragments of truth. One Monday, last August, I went to the central city mortuary. I go there very often to count bodies. I know the staff. They're kind to me. They give me lots of cups of tea. Good to have, because often the electricity has failed and it's very hot and there are flies all over the corpses while I'm counting them. That Monday morning, by 9 o'clock, there were 9 dead bodies. By 12 o'clock, there were 26, including a young woman, hands tied behind her back, shot 3 times in the head, a baby shot in the face. There are death squads now in Baghdad, working for everybody, including, I suspect, the Iraqi government, but also the insurgents, the Shiites, the Sunnis, all kinds of groups. Then they let me use their computer and look up the total deaths by violence in Baghdad for July. These are the official figures, government figures, which we're told don't exist because it's too difficult to get hold of them. The British and American authorities have told the Iraqi authorities not to give these figures to journalists, not even to allow us into the mortuaries. Fortunately, the medical authorities and I know each other well. Fisk goes in the back gate. So I looked on the computer and I found that the total deaths by violence, not heart attacks or strokes, deaths by violence of Iraqis in just Baghdad, in just July alone, was 1,100. The highest figure ever recorded at the medical centre, more than half the total figure of American dead since March, April of 2003, in just July, in just Baghdad. Now, add Mosul, Kirkuk, to some extent Erbil, Ramadi, Fallujah, Bakuba, Amara, Najaf, Kerbala, Basra, and all the other cities of Iraq, we must be talking of 3,000 or 4,000 a month. That's 36 or 48,000 a year, which means that 100,000 figure, which was poo-pooed by Bush and Blair, may actually be quite conservative. These are the little fragments we can still do, but I ask myself, is it worth the risk? Each trip to the mortuary, 20 minutes only, because after 20 minutes, the guys with the mobile phones outside have had enough time to call in 3 armed men with a car to take away any foolish grey-haired foreigner who happens to be wandering around the mortuary. We all have our nightmares in life, and mine is sitting in front of a video camera with my hands tied, asking Mr. Blair to withdraw British troops from Iraq. We all have these nightmares. So did the Guardian correspondent, if you read his graphic report of being kidnapped a couple of weeks ago. So over and over again, how do we carry on in these circumstances? And can we carry on? The Algerian war was hard enough. We gave ourselves 10 minutes only there when we went to a shop before the throat cutters would arrive. And yet you need to go out in the streets of Baghdad. I have a favourite restaurant called the Ramaya, big red neon sign, international menu, bottles of fine Lebanese red wine, near the Tigris River. So with some friends, I decided in August, let's just try and have a half-hour lunch. Let's have a crack at it, see if we can have lunch out in a Baghdad restaurant. Until we arrived and found it was now called the Al-Khair al-Zamoun. Zamoun al-Khair, much more Islamic name. And it was a green neon sign now. And when I went inside the restaurant, the menu, which had been in English, French, and Arabic, was now only in Arabic. And there was no more Lebanese red wine. You see, my favorite restaurant had been Islamicized. And you need to go and see this if you want to know what the people of Baghdad are living. They go to these restaurants. So I wrote a whole article about how my restaurant had gone from red to green. Very short period of time. It was in a Shiite area, of course. There was no alcohol served there anymore. So you saw how Iraq was changing in a way that the Bushes and the Blairs are not going to learn or understand. Did we invade, we ask ourselves in our articles, Iraq for oil? Of course we did. Of course we did. The oil ministry and the Ministry of Interior were the only 2 ministries that were saved from burning and looters when the Americans entered Baghdad. And if, for example, the net export, the national export of Iraq was asparagus or cauliflower or grapes, I don't think the 82nd Airborne would be in Mosul, and I don't think the 3rd Infantry Division would be in Baghdad. But there's something else. Not so long ago, I was on Highway 8, the throat-cutting insurgency road south of Baghdad, investigating the murder of a poor Red Cross driver who'd been killed in his vehicle, talking to an Iraqi family who I think had probably seen the gunman who did the killing. And the ground began to shake. tremblement de terre, as the French say. And up the road, powering up the road, was the biggest military convoy I've ever seen in my life. Mile after mile after mile of it, 4.25 hours it took to pass. Abrams, M1, A1 tanks, Bradley fighting armoured vehicles, Humvee after Humvee, hundreds of trucks with tens of thousands of line troops with their rifles pointing out of the side of the lorries like porcupine quills into the wilderness of occupation. Apache helicopters turning over the palm groves like some big rodents going backwards and forwards. Extraordinary experience to watch it. And I sat there with the family in the muck at the side of the road and watched this, and I thought, 2,000 years ago, a little bit more to the west, in Syria or Lebanon, the ground would have shaken beneath the tramp of the feet of Roman legions. And I realized, I think then more than ever, that a superpower has a visceral need to project military strength. We can go to Baghdad, so we will go to Baghdad. We can topple Saddam. We'll send our soldiers across Sumeria and all the lands of the caliphates and the land where civilization supposedly began. Let's go. But when you're an Iraqi, and Iraqi is a very educated people, it looks a little different. An Iraqi asked me when I was last in Baghdad, Mr. Robert, why is it the Americans are everywhere in our area? And he listed the countries: Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan. These are American military forces, Air Force, Special Forces, infantry units. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Turkey, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Oman, Yemen, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, still part of Saudi Arabia. I mean, why are we here? Why are you there? It actually starts further north. Greenland, Iceland, Britain, Germany, Bosnia, Yugoslavia now, Italy, Greece, joining up with the Turkish bit. There is now an iron curtain from the ice cap to the borders of Somalia. Why? And why does it run through the Middle East? Why is it that the American military bases, newly established in eastern Afghanistan, and it's Maariv, the Israeli paper that spotted this, follow exactly the route of the gas pipeline which the Americans want to build from the former Muslim states of the Soviet Union to Pakistan? What are we doing in the Middle East? We want always to give the Arabs democracy. We want them desperately to have democracy. We push it at them, we threaten them with democracy. And I think they'd like some of that democracy. I think they'd like a couple of boxes of human rights off our Western supermarket shelves. I think they would. But I also think they want a different kind of freedom. I think they would like freedom from us. Always. Always, when we come to liberate the peoples of the Middle East, we seem to arrive, as we did in Lebanon, of course, in 1982, with our 155mm artillery and our Apache helicopters and our swords and our horses and our Humvees and our Abrams tanks. I think, that the Muslim world would like a serious, moral, mature relationship with us. And I think we should have one with the Arab world. We can stay there. But why do we always take our armies there? After the First World War, before we, the British and the French, chopped up and carved up the Middle East, there was a bright shining light from the United States. The American diplomats of the Middle East, who were the consuls to the dying Ottoman Empire, and all the American NGOs, who of course were missionaries at that stage, all petitioned the State Department that there should be one modern, democratic Arab state, stretching from the southern border of Turkey, the eastern border of Mesopotamia, Iraq, right across to the Atlantic coast of Morocco. This would be a state like any other European state planned for the forthcoming century. But of course, as we know, President Woodrow Wilson fell sick and died. America moved into isolationism. On the Hill, they weren't interested. They didn't fulfill the American mandate for Kurdistan, which might have solved the Kurdish problem, or Armenia. Armenia was to be reconstituted inside Turkey, not the rump state with Yerevan as its capital, which has survived to this day. And so the Americans declined to actually even join the League of Nations. It was very remarkable. One of the good things for my paper, Ask My Foreign Editor, who works out our budget, is that because I, every 3.5 weeks on average, come and give lectures in the United States, I'm often around Harvard or New York when the UN is holding important meetings. My foreign editor loves this. He doesn't pay the airfare, he just gets the copy, you see. And on September 12th, 2002, I was in the UN General Assembly to listen to President George W. Bush threatening the United Nations. If it didn't abide by its duties, it would be as irrelevant as the League of Nations, he said. Ignoring the fact, if he knew it, that the League of Nations failed because the superpowers in the League of Nations refused to abide by its resolutions. In particular, France and Belgium, which occupied the Saarland of Germany to get its reparations under the Treaty of Versailles. Bush was apparently unaware that one of the reasons why the League of Nations also failed is that America refused to join it. The United Nations is a creation of the United Nations, of Truman and the ideas of Roosevelt. Odd thing about the UN, when you go there and you actually see these wonderful characters in real face, you see things you cannot see on television. I'll give an example. When Colin Powell made his famous weapons of mass destruction announcement in February of 2003, I was actually at MIT, so I came down. I couldn't resist watching Powell. And extraordinary things happened. George Tenet came in, first of all, looking like Edward G. Robinson, sat just behind Powell like this. No movement of his face, no smiles, nothing. Powell came in glad-handing everyone. You know, the Security Council has its names, you know, United States, United Kingdom, they're all alphabetical. So Powell was over here. And on the other side, I suddenly saw our own dear Foreign Minister of the day, Jack Straw, my favourite ex-trot. And he came into the room in this massive power suit that seemed to have been wound twice round him, a grey, glossy suit. And he came in like this. And he suddenly saw Powell, and his little feet carried him right round the front of the desk into the big arms of the Americans. It was a wonderful example of the Blair government at work. Don't ask me about Blair. I am still mystified by the whole Blair government's behaviour. In any event, here in the United Nations, one is forced to ask a question which is pivotal to comprehending, I suspect, the Middle East. Can we switch history off? Can we turn to the Middle East as we can to ourselves and say, let's start again? We can do it. We in the West can do it. The end of the Second World War, the death of Hitler, the death of Mussolini, the destruction of the Japanese Empire, the founding of the United Nations, the start of what was to become the European Union, the end of the Cold War. I suppose somewhere in there 9/11 will come in the future, I'm not sure. But we can close the doors on history and start again. And we think we can tell the Arabs and the Israelis to do the same thing, but we can't. Mohammed Abu Rudaina lives in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp, scarcely 2 miles from my home in Beirut. And when he gets up in the morning, he rises in muck and filth and dirt amid taps that spew out brown water. And he is there as a direct result of the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when we, the British, gave our support to a Jewish homeland in Palestine on condition that the native Arab inhabitants didn't have their rights in any way taken away. Of course, we betrayed both the Jews and the Arabs. The Jews had every right to believe that we meant all of Palestine, not the bit on the left next to the sea. And the Arabs had every right to believe that they would stay in their homes. We didn't in the Balfour Declaration say they'd have to leave. But for Mohammed Abu Rudaina, our betrayal of what Balfour said is the specific reason why he gets up in the morning in the dirt and muck of the Sabra and Shatila camp. For him, Balfour was yesterday, this morning, an hour ago. We can't go back and say, oh, sorry about Oslo, didn't work, did it? We've got a roadmap now. And we can't put the roadmap back on track. We're always putting the Oslo train back on track. Now the roadmap has to be reinvigorated because we have to have not a Palestinian state, but a viable Palestinian state. I love that word viable. It's a very Blairite word. I'll tell you, I know somebody who has listened to a conversation between Blair and Bush about the issue of Palestine. This is, I promise you, this is true. And Blair keeps saying to Bush, you know, we've got to deal with the Palestine question. The Palestinian-Israeli question is central to the Middle East. And Bush keeps saying, yeah, I hear you, Tony, I hear you. Whether the British Prime Minister got what that meant, I don't know. But I hear you. It's okay, I hear you. You know, our reporting of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, in one way, helps to create the continuance of that conflict. Because if you look at your newspapers or you watch television, Even the BBC is getting into this, BBC World Service Television. You'll find that mysteriously, that huge wall that runs through Abu Dis and around Jerusalem is not a wall, it's a fence. Or it's a barrier, or it's a security barrier, in the same way that the occupied area of South Lebanon from 1978 to 2000 was a security zone and not an occupied area. In the same way, the occupied territory of the West Bank has, Deus Ex Machina, turned into the disputed territory. A sort of dispute you can solve in a law court over a cup of tea, right? And colonies became settlements, I'm not quite sure when, and now very often become, quote, Jewish neighborhoods. A neighborhood, nice friendly place, like a neighborhood here in like Berkeley. And thus you see even a Palestinian who throws one stone is incomprehensible. Why would anyone use violence when you've got a small dispute over a piece of territory? When you've got a fence that people don't like? When you've got a neighborhood, nice friendly place like a neighborhood? Thus you see we make our reporting of the Middle East incomprehensible to anyone in this country who doesn't know the region or hasn't been there. And thus we make the Palestinians generically violent. Why on earth would they use violence in this kind of environment, you see? Now, I'm against violence by anyone, ever, for any reason. But the fact of the matter is that our reporting now makes inexplicable anything violent which the Palestinians do. And explicable anything the Israelis do, which is violent, because they're always retaliating against terror. Thus, our journalism, you see, is lethal, but it isn't the only kind of lethality that we as journalists are involved in. Go back now to 1991 and the road north of Kuwait up to Basra. I was on that road. And with an independent television crew, I came across a terrible scene. Across the desert lay dozens of dismembered bodies. Bombs had hit in the desert there. Women and children as well. Refugees fleeing from Iraq to Kuwait, Kuwait to Iraq, as well as many soldiers. And out of the desert came packs of dogs. It was lunchtime. They were hungry. And as we stood there, they ripped apart the bodies of men, women, and children and took off arms and legs to eat in the desert. They were hungry. ITV filmed this. And I said to the crew, what on earth are you doing this for? You'll never get this on television. They'll not let it through. He said, Bob, it's just for the archives. Now, that night, I could write exactly what I saw with all the detail of a medical report in my paper, The Independent, which I did. But, of course, it did not get on television because television editors in New York, London, Paris, wherever, are so sensitive about what their viewers might feel. It's pornographic to do this. It's obscene. It doesn't do justice to the dead who should be honoured. And anyway, who wants to watch this when they're having breakfast or lunch or tea or dinner? And so the reality of the war, which we see, is taken from you. You don't have to look at it. And in this way, we connive with governments that want you to support wars. We present you with a bloodless sandpit, unless, of course, an Iraqi has been obliging enough to die in a romantic attitude beside the road. I think this is one of the most dangerous parts of television reporting at the moment, that we constantly show a vision of war which is a lie. It is dirty, it smells, it is vile. I say over and over again, and my editor in London, Simon Kellner, always grits his teeth when I say the same thing. War is primarily not about victory and defeat, as Hollywood would suggest. War is primarily about death and the infliction of death, and represents the total failure of the human spirit, whoever starts it. I wish I could finish by saying something optimistic. I don't see much optimism around. Iraq is chaos, from Mosul and Kirkuk all the way down to Basra. Drive Highway 8 with me and you'll see what I saw. Burned out American vehicles, smashed police vehicles, abandoned checkpoints, armed insurgents for 80 miles, all the way to Najaf. It's over in Iraq. The project is finished. There is no future for democracy, referenda, constitutions. This is something we play out in our living rooms in Washington and London, or in the Green Zone in Baghdad. The real world of the Iraqis is almost too terrible to imagine. A friend of mine on the Irish Times went to the referendum on the Constitution a few weeks ago and was interviewing a Shiite family who were just voting. And in the middle of the conversation, she asked the young woman, "Do you have any children?" And she began weeping. And the husband said quietly, "We had a son and he was kidnapped last year and we haven't seen him since." Thousands and thousands and thousands of Iraqis are being kidnapped now. Women are being sold into sexual slavery and taken via Syria to South Yemen, to Aden, where brothels have been set up. 2 of them managed to get back to Iraq, and both were told by their brothers that they would be killed for honor reasons. My researcher managed to get to Mahmoudiyya and rescue one of them and get her into a home for women in Baghdad where she'd be safe. Men and women are now fearful every day that their children will be kidnapped. And often they are, for money. And often the money is paid, and the parents are told where to find the child, and they do find the child dead. Perhaps that baby with a bullet in its face, which I saw in the mortuary. In the living rooms, often it's just one room in the house of the slums of Sadr City, they are not discussing constitutional niceties. They're wondering how to get money to buy fuel in a country which has the largest oil reserves in the world and which now imports oil from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia to fuel their generator, to give them electric light because there's only 4 hours of electricity a day, to keep the fridge running so that they can keep their food fresh, so that they can have air conditioning in the heat which exists even in winter in that part of Iraq. That is the Iraq we're now talking about. These 2 levels of reality, that of the suicide bombers of Baghdad and the constant danger for families. There's about 150,000 Iraqis, possibly 250,000, already fled Baghdad to Amman, to live in Jordan, to escape from this wonderful, new, brilliant democracy which we're promising we're building in Iraq. Extraordinary thing happens now, Whenever you say, look, there's, 70 dead, 80 dead, 7 more suicide bombings, the answer comes back from the green zone. Yes, but you see, they're getting desperate. It's only because things are getting better. Imagine trying this out in the Iraqis. Things are getting worse because they're getting better. And if they're getting better, they're going to get worse. Good luck. You see, it's a problem, isn't it? And I tell you, I look back now and I see the Middle East sinking deeper and deeper into this non-future, as I always call it. I wake each morning in Beirut in the morning, I hear the palm fronds clustering outside my bedroom window, and I hear the Mediterranean, I think, where's the explosion today? I don't mean literally, although often it turns out to be that. Just remember, when the Hezbollah were fighting the Israelis in South Lebanon, there would be usually 1 suicide bombing a month. That was extraordinary. In the Intifada, it was sometimes once or even twice a week. In Baghdad, it's sometimes 7 a day. Walmart suicide bombers. What do? Call up from Ramadi. This is Ramadi. Is that Mosul? We need 2 more for tomorrow. I don't know how this works. But I will tell you one thing. This is an ideological war that we embarked upon in Iraq. And when you go on in ideological wars, you only look at that information and intelligence which fits with what you want, or with what Mr. Wolfowitz wanted, or Mr. Pearl wanted, or Mr. Feith wanted, or Mr. Cheney wanted. And thus, when bin Laden spoke 5 weeks before the British and American invasion of March, April 2003, we knew there was an audio tape, and we asked the usual stupid questions. Is it bin Laden? Is he alive? How long ago did he make it? Where is he? We didn't listen to the tape. I managed to get an entire set of everything he said from September 11th, 2001 to the present day printed up. Don't bother to read it, it's boring. But 5 weeks before the invasion, he made this statement in which he said he addressed the Muslims of Iraq. He meant the Sunni Muslim, Wahhabi type people like himself. And he said, in the time of the first Crusades, he meant what we call the Crusades of the 11th and 12th centuries, he said the followers of the Prophet made an alliance with the Persians, who were not Muslims then, they were Zoroastrians, and it did no harm to the followers of the Prophet, and they were able to use that alliance to destroy the Crusaders. In the same way, he said, it is permissible for Muslims in Iraq to make an alliance with the socialists. He meant the Baathists, the Iraq army of the 1988 war. The socialists, he said, remain infidels, but it is in our interest to make an alliance with them against the Second Crusaders. That was the moment, ladies and gentlemen, when the suicide bombers of Al-Qaeda and the army of the shadows, which had been disbanded by Paul Bremer, the second American proconsul in Baghdad shortly after the occupation, the Iraqi army came together. That was the detonator. And the Iraqi army is indeed the insurgency, the Iraqi side of the insurgency. I met 3 of the insurgency leaders less than a year ago in a neighboring country, not Syria, it was Jordan. And the first man who walked in, who was a general in the Iraqi army, said, Mr. Robert, we meet again. And I said, I haven't met you before. He said, yes, you have, he said. You were under fire on the Iraqi front line outside Basra in 1980 when we invaded Iran. And I was the colonel who brought the first tanks, Iraqi tanks, across the Karun River. And you climbed on my tank and interviewed me. When I got back to Beirut, I don't use internet or computers. I put up all my paper files, and there he was. I did interview him in September of 1980. So that you see, the insurgency leaders are the commanders of the Gulf of the 1980-88 Iran-Iraq war. These are the men who fought for 8 years in suicidal battles against a massively superior force, the Iranians, and held the line. These are the men who, in many cases, tens of thousands of them, went off to prison camps for 10 years in Iran, twice as long as any POW of the Second World War, and then came back to find their families being torn to pieces by sanctions. This is the insurgents, who were once called, you may remember, remnants and dead-enders. Do you remember that? Diehards, Bremer used to call them. We don't call them that now. And an odd thing happened, again, because we didn't learn about the people of Iraq. I don't think we care about Iraqis. I don't think we care about Arabs very much. We thought that if we captured Saddam, the insurgency would end. Ladies and gentlemen, we got him. Remember Bremer's famous press conference? But 3 months before that, in Ramadi, which is a city further west from Fallujah, I was talking to a young man whose parents had just been shot at an American checkpoint. They got too close to it. 50 meters, we will use deadly force, it says on the road signs and on the back of all American vehicles in Iraq. And he said, he said, last night the resistance came to my home, he told me, and asked me to join the Muqawamah. And I said, did you join? He said, no, he said, I didn't, because you see, if we drive the Americans out, Saddam might come back. But if the Americans capture or kill Saddam, then I'll join the resistance. Yes. And indeed, after Saddam was captured, the insurgency took off like a firestorm. How wrong we got it, you see. Heaven knows what happens if we capture Osama bin Laden. One thing about that, by the way, it doesn't matter if he's dead or alive. He has created Al-Qaeda, the monster is born. It's like the nuclear bomb. Once you have nuclear weapons, you can arrest all the nuclear scientists in the world. Makes no difference, the bomb is there. Al-Qaeda as an institution now exists. We can capture or kill bin Laden. I think it makes no difference. He's irrelevant now. But thus perhaps you grasp the sense of pessimism I have about the Middle East at the moment. I hope perhaps Lebanon provides a nice little story. Lebanese people do feel freer. In restaurants now in Beirut, when I'm talking politics, I don't look over my shoulder like that. I just glance a little bit to each side, not so much. Maybe Lebanon can be a bright, shining light. But for the rest of the Middle East, I fear greatly. I think I should still write at the end of my reports, watch out. As I said before, I used to think that watching the history of the Middle East was a great privilege. Nowadays, 30 years later, when I can see people in San Francisco or Paris, families with children are happy, I think, what did I miss out on in life? Maybe this privilege of mine was a curse. And if it was, then my book is the story of my curse. Thank you very much.